Welcome, everyone, to the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, coming to you from the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast studios at the world-famous Reliance Mine Saloon in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I am your co-host, licensed battlefield guide Eric Lindblade, and I am, as always, joined by my co-host, licensed battlefield guide Jim Hessler. Jim, what do we have on tap today for the episode?
Well, Eric, and welcome to all the listeners once again. After doing a couple of serious, weighty episodes recently, The Life of Louis Armstead, multi-part episode on the Peach Orchard, What Was Lee Thinking, we're going to step back and lighten up a little bit this week and talk about The Killer Angels, and more specifically, its motion picture incarnation, Gettysburg, or as many of our audience knows it, the movie. Eric, I can't think of a better way to engage millennials and a cool younger audience than to dissect a 4.5-hour Ted Turner historical epic from 1993. But to our core audience, you either love the movie and you can recite every line by heart, or you hate the movie and you can still recite every line by heart, or you are the type of Civil War enthusiast who never watches movies because you only read books. But hopefully you have read The Killer Angels, because Eric and I think between The Killer Angels and the motion picture, this classic story of historical fiction has had a greater impact on Gettysburg interpretation than any other medium. It has introduced millions of people to Gettysburg, and that makes The Killer Angels the most important book ever written. So, my friends, sit back with Eric and I and revisit the golden years of 1992 to 1993 and the movie Gettysburg. We will dissect the good. What does the movie get right? The bad, what it gets wrong. The ugly, Longstreet's beard, and the legacy of this historical epic movie. Before we do that, though, do we have any housekeeping to take care of?
In addition to the listeners, we've had a lot of interaction on our social media, especially on Facebook, but of course we are now also on Twitter and Instagram. So you can find us on Facebook at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, also on Twitter at Gettysburg Pod, and on Instagram at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. You can also reach us by email at gettysburgpodcast@gmail.com. So we do want to thank everybody for their interactions, shares, their support. It really means a lot, and also I think helps shape the episodes as they go. We get a lot of great listener questions, so really you're as much of a part of this show as we are. So we really appreciate the help and the support. Also want to thank, once again, our superfan Mike Reinhardt for his work that he's doing on Twitter. I'm not doing a lot of work on Twitter. He's mostly running the show over there. So want to thank him for that, what he's doing week in and week out.
I am giving superfan Mike Reinhardt a battlefield promotion. He is no longer a superfan. He is our social media director. How about that? Mike, if you're listening, hopefully that's good with you. You know, we can't pay you anything, but we appreciate all of the time and effort that you're putting into this.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike has been a great help and certainly takes a lot of work off of our desk here when we do this. So certainly want to thank him again for all the effort that he's put in.
And, you know, as I've said before, I'm actually not on Twitter and Instagram. My kids are, but, you know, I'm one of these old people who's only on Facebook. But, you know, keep it clean, keep it good, and, you know, report back every once in a while and just kind of let this old man know how things are going on Twitter.
And just so you know, your daughter did become a fan of ours on
I told
Instagram.
Her to. That's nice.
So, you know, you are paying for her college.
I know. And
it's the least she can do.
And now you and Mike Reinhardt might hear from my daughter more than I do, so that'd be great.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, there you go, right?
Well, I would say she hasn't liked anything we've done.
I'll talk to her about that.
Okay, fair enough. She's not.
She's not. No, she really isn't. Good. You know, she might not be listening, but at least she adds to our millennial demographic on social media, right? Does that count?
And that's the key, making history cool for the kids.
Exactly.
So our topic today is going to be on the Killer Angels and sort of by default, the movie Gettysburg. So Jim, what are your first memories of the Killer Angels or the movie Gettysburg? And kind of how did that impact your journey as a historian?
That's a great question, Eric. My memories of the motion picture actually come before the book, The Killer Angels. You know, as I've told people on tours and that sort of thing, I was always a history enthusiast, but I was not a hardcore Gettysburg person. So I have a distinct memory in I believe it's the fall of 1993 of when this movie was released into the theaters. I did not go see it. My brother and my brother-in-law, and by the way, my brother-in-law listens to the show, but my brother and my brother-in-law mother-in-law went and saw it in the theaters, but I did not. I did, however, watch it for the first time when it was on TV, when they started showing it repetitively in 1994. And I got to be honest, the first time I watched it on TV, I thought it was a little flat. A lot of talking, the action was so-so. So I was not really into it. But that subsequent Christmas, my future mother-in-law got me a copy of The Killer Angels for Christmas. And I read The Killer Angels. I liked The Killer Angels. And now kind of the light bulb went off and I said, okay, now I get where all this talking and speechifying is coming from in the movie. So the next time I watched the movie, I saw it in a completely different light and really enjoyed it. And I won't go into details now, but it's certainly something that has seriously influenced my Gettysburg career. How about you, Eric? What are your memories of it?
Yeah, my distinct memory is in October of 1993. I was in the 5th grade. My mother checked me out of Stedman Elementary School early to go see the 1 o'clock showing at the Cross Creek Mall in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And as a kid, it blew me away.
Yeah.
I had already been interested in the Civil War. I had made my first visit there in 1989, so I've already was kind of exposed to Gettysburg, but this was also, for me, kind of this mini golden age of the Civil War.
Yeah.
You have not only Ken Burns' The Civil War came out a few years earlier, you have the movie Glory,
Yep.
You have Civil War Journal on A&E or
Yep.
History later, and then here comes Gettysburg. So as a kid, all of this just kind of combined to keep me fascinated by the story. And for me, it was kind of neat seeing these larger-than-life characters that I've been studying about now on the big screen. And I think it was an important part of me continuing to be interested in the Civil War and moving on as I did to eventually become a historian, eventually battlefield guide.
Yeah, so had you read The Killer Angels at that time, or did you start with the movie?
I had not read The Killer Angels. After the movie came out, you would see in the end credits based on The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. So
Right.
I went and got a copy of it and read it and enjoyed it. And I think, like you, it added an extra depth to the movie. If you've never read the book and you watch the movie, it maybe doesn't make as much sense as what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's a real problem when you see people today dissecting the movie on social media. Probably one of the most common criticisms I always see is, why isn't David Ireland and Culp's Hill, why are they not in the movie? We had a question today, why is the 83rd Pennsylvania not in the movie? Folks, they're not in the movie because they're not in the book. And Shara, for better or worse, decided to tell the story from the viewpoints of several specific officers: Lee, Longstreet, Chamberlain, Hancock, Buford, Armstead. I don't think I forgot anybody, but those are the primary characters in the book. So when you make a 4.5-hour movie adaptation of that book, you really don't have a whole lot of extra time to throw in another hour on Culp's Hill. So folks, this movie is based on a Pulitzer Prize winning book, and that is why these other characters are not in it. Hell, I want to know why Dan Sickles is not in the movie, and Eric and I will talk about a little bit about that during this week's upcoming edition of the Dan Sickles Report.
It's always important, I tell people this on tours, to remember this movie was based off of a work of historical fiction.
Yep.
It was never intended to be a work of history. It was never intended to be a documentary. So there is going to be some license that is taken to move this thing forward, to try to make it entertaining. But its importance, at least to me, is that it was sort of this gateway to the story of Gettysburg for a lot of people.
Exactly.
That people aren't rushing out and picking up Edwin Coddington.
Right.
That's not their book, or High Tide at Gettysburg by Glenn Tucker. This, for many people, might have very well been their very first Gettysburg book, and it opens up the story to them.
Absolutely. That's the idea, folks. It's trying to introduce you to the story from the point of view of several key characters. You mentioned the H word, or the H words, historical fiction, and obviously that is a sticking point for a lot of people. Frankly, a lot of our colleagues have a hard time with this historical fiction concept. I don't really have a problem with it. Again, you use the term gateway, and I think that's the right way to look at it. If you can turn people on to the Battle of Gettysburg by telling a great story, I'm kind of okay with some of the liberties that are taken, as long as, it gives the opportunity for somebody then to maybe read a Coddington and to learn more about it. And if anybody is out there saying I'm full of it and I'm wrong, no, you're wrong, because that was exactly my gateway to the Battle of Gettysburg. I started with the movie, I started with the Killer Angels. It inspired me to read more factually accurate things. I now have 3 books, 18 years of battlefield guiding, and a co-hosted podcast under my belt. So folks, that gateway is important.
Yeah, and I usually don't bash the movie. I mean, I'll make a joke about bad beards. Yeah, you can't not do that. But to me, whatever gets you here, that's what's important to me.
I agree too.
And there's a lot of guides that have made a lot of money over the years because people saw this movie, they read the book and said, you know what, I want to go to Gettysburg. I want to hear a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I'll sometimes have colleagues that say, oh, I had to talk about Joshua Chamberlain again, had to talk about Louis Armistead again. To me, as a guide, I really don't care. If that's what you want, if that's what's going to connect you to this place, I'll talk about Chamberlain for 2 hours.
I will
do
too. So I'm with you, and I think you and I are like-minded on that. The other thing I'll add to, and I'm not going to call anybody out here, I know friends and colleagues who were inspired to come to Gettysburg because of the success of that movie, and now they pretend they were not. Now they pretend they always hated the movie. They pretend they always hated Chamberlain in the 20th Maine. I'm calling bull. I know for a fact, because I knew you 20 years ago, and I know for a fact that you, like me, were inspired to come to Gettysburg by this movie. So stop pretending you're too cool for school and just admit, this movie and this book did serve its role to get people interested in the Battle of Gettysburg.
So now that Jim and I have established the impact that this movie and book has had on our careers as historians, Jim, let's get a little background on the book as well as the movie itself. How did it come to be?
Sure. Well, again, I won't go in too deep dive on the background of this. Frankly, as I've kind of alluded to, this was before my time. But again, The Killer Angels came out in 1974. As we said, it was a historical novel written by Michael Shara. It was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1975. And as we've said, we think the strength of it is primarily the character-driven approach, as it's told from the perspective of several officers in the Army. But in terms of its influence, Killer Angels has been required readings at times in various military academies and officer candidate schools throughout the country, including the U.S. Army War College. So from the perspective of not only having an important influence on guys like us, frankly, it's influenced military training. So in addition to the primary success of the novel being this gateway introduction that it has made for a lot of people, obviously it's had some significant impacts on interpretation. That's one of the reasons, other than being fans, that Eric and I wanted to cover this at a podcast level. It's elevated the profile of Joshua Chamberlain in the 20th Maine. So we need to talk about that a little bit. But also using James Longstreet's memoirs as a primary source, it helped to significantly enhance Longstreet's reputation. Now, again, if you go to social media, some people think Longstreet's reputation still needs work, and some are still fighting the lost cause. But clearly, since the book came out in 74 and the movie in 93, Longstreet's image has taken a huge upswing because of this. I think, too, and I think we should talk about, Eric, that it's also elevated John Buford's reputation. I think Buford is one of the enduring legacies of all of this. But you touched on Ken Burns earlier, and Ken Burns has said that the novel greatly influenced his PBS Civil War production. And as anybody who has watched the Gettysburg segment of Ken Burns knows, particularly his treatment of Chamberlain and the 20th Maine. So even if you want to acknowledge that maybe the book or the movie have not had as far-reaching of an audience as Eric and I think it has, certainly Ken Burns did. And when Ken Burns talks about Chamberlain and the obscure textbook maneuver, that reached millions of people through his PBS series, and frankly is still reaching people into the future. So I think those are all things that have come out of the success of the book that we should talk about.
And one item that really stuck out to me when we look at when The Killer Angels comes out, it's 1974. Let's think about Gettysburg historiography. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of stuff coming out in the 1960s.
Yeah.
We have a lot of things coming out in the 1980s, the 1990s. There's not a lot of great works of the Battle of Gettysburg coming out in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, the reason for that is America is tired of war. just getting out of the Vietnam conflict. Americans have seen it in their living rooms while they're eating dinner. They've had enough of it. So really, you see military history in the 70s, it's kind of the dark ages in many respects. So here we have this novel coming through. And I did do a reread of The Killer Angels, and I think what you see is, at times, almost an anti-war bent to it. So I think it is influenced heavily by its contemporary moment that it was a part of. Not that we're going to become literary critics here. This is not our job. But I do think you can't escape that. And I think at times the depiction of, say, a John Buckland in the 2nd Maine, or some of these common soldiers kind of caught up in this, I think there's a lot to that. And I think it speaks to not only this historical event in 1863, but also the mood of the nation in the mid-1970s.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I've heard that comment before, that it was written in the Vietnam era with an anti-war slant. I particularly, when I read it, have never really gotten that anti-war slant. But as you said, we're not here today to be literary critics, and other people have said that as well. The copy that I own, which I'm looking at right now, actually has an endorsement on the cover from General Norman Schwarzkopf that says, quote, "the best and most realistic historical novel about war that I have ever read." I don't particularly find the war aspects of it all that realistic, but who am I to argue with Norman Schwarzkopf about what war is really like? But the other thing, going back to the earlier comments on the back, the other endorsement I have on my copy is from Ken Burns, filmmaker, and it says, quote, "remarkable, a book that changed my life. I had never visited Gettysburg, knew almost nothing about that battle before I read the book, but here it all comes alive." But I do think it does a good job of bringing Gettysburg alive.
So The Killer Angels is going to be out there. It's, of course, going to win a Pulitzer Prize. But it will not be until it gets into the hands of a filmmaker named Ron Maxwell that it's going to begin to kind of take on a new life. And when I was doing a little bit of research on the making, this was a project that was pitched for a long time. A number of studios turned it down. A number of folks didn't really have an interest. Finally, he's going to find the right guy in Ted Turner, who's going to help bring this to life.
That's exactly right. Again, this is not something I have personal knowledge of, so I had to research this topic like we would any other historical topic. And what they've said is that for Mr. Maxwell, this really became a 15-year odyssey to try to bring the story to the screen. And as you said, Eric, taking the screenplay or taking the story from studio to studio, and supposedly some studios said, we like it, but we're not going to do it. And, thinking about how costly this type of piece could have been. Again, I've seen reports that said Maxwell sold his house in New York and had to borrow money from his friends to keep the project alive until, as you said, he came along to Ted Turner, the media mogul out of Atlanta, Georgia, who Civil War buff and obviously took a shining to the project. And warts and all about the movie, in all seriousness, I have no idea if Ron or Ted Turner are listening tonight, but I do want to thank those gentlemen for their perseverance in bringing this story to the big screen. The movie, as we'll talk about, might not be perfect, but as I sit in 2019, it remains the best version of Gettysburg we have on the screen. So I want to thank those guys for doing this.
And one of the things that even sticks out to me today about the movie is actually the cast. I mean, it's a pretty solid cast when you look at it. I am far from an expert on motion pictures, but I know a number of these actors. I think a lot of our listeners will recognize them. They've done some pretty big things in their career. So to pull this talent together for a project like this was a pretty impressive aspect of it.
Yeah, I seem to recall some promotion at the time featuring it as an all-star cast. That might be a little bit of a stretch, but it is a really solid ensemble cast. You've got Tom Berenger as James Longstreet. I always remember Berenger from Platoon and Major League. Right?
To me, he's always Indians catcher Jake Taylor.
Exactly. Or, was he Sergeant Barnes in Platoon? I gotta think of the name. Yeah, Sergeant Barnes, right? Right. That's what I always think of when I see Berenger. We had Jeff Daniels as Joshua Chamberlain. I didn't really know Jeff Daniels at the time, but my wife did from some of the chick flicks type of stuff. Martin Sheen as Robert E. Lee, easily the most controversial aspect of it, and we should talk a little bit about that. Stephen Lang as George Pickett. I remembered him from some 80s cop shows. Sam Elliott is John Buford. I think Elliott is the one that endures today. And let's not forget Kevin Conway as the iconic Buster Kilrain. Now, we're not going to turn the podcast into IMDb and go into all the credits these guys have. If you're familiar with them, great. If not, go look them up. But like Eric said, it's a pretty solid cast. Oh, And how could I forget Richard Jordan as Louis Armstead? Because Wayne told his story last week about giving Jordan some advice on how to portray Armstead. If you folks didn't listen to our previous episode, you should. Wayne had a story about working with Jordan on his Armstead portrayal.
And that, of course, is episode 7. You can find it in our archives. You can find it on your podcast episode listing. So if you haven't listened to it, certainly tune in, because I think there's going to be some things that apply to this episode that we talked about even last week.
So let's just talk a little bit about Jeff Daniels. He was quoted in one of the newspapers at the time as saying that he was initially unnerved by that peculiar creature known as the Civil War reenactor. Now, anybody who's familiar with this film knows that they really needed the help and support of the reenactors to make it happen. I don't think they would have had the budget to do the battle scenes to the scale that they did had it not been for the volunteer efforts of the reenactors who they came on set, donated their time and their equipment. But I guess Daniels was initially shaken by this a little bit, and Daniels said that during the filming, none of them ever referred to him as anything but Colonel Chamberlain, and they often saluted him as they passed. This is now Daniels talking, quote, "You're sitting there in a t-shirt, jeans, drinking a Diet Coke, and they're walking by, saluting and saying, 'Sir,' the first time you want to say, 'Get a life.'" But then it keeps happening, and you realize the importance of the war, of Gettysburg to them, and you realize this ain't just a job to them. And I think when you see interviews from other cast members before, during, and after the production, hopefully they're not just acting, they're being sincere, but you get the sense that as everybody was here and working through this, they really got a sense of, the importance of the topic, the importance of the Battle of Gettysburg to not only the reenactors, but to the audience.
And to me, I feel that Daniels did a magnificent job as Chamberlain in his portrayal. I think that's generally regarded in common thought about that. But to me, even today, when I think about Chamberlain, when I think about the battle, in my mind, it's Jeff Daniels as Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I kind of equate it to George C. Scott's performance of Patton.
Yeah.
When you read about Patton, you're not reading about Patton. You're reading it through the lens of George C. Scott playing Patton. And in many ways, that's the same, I think, with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain as Jeff Daniels. And I think that speaks a lot to the enduring impact that role had in his performance in it.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I know, again, over the years, I've heard people nitpick, oh, he's too tall to play Chamberlain. Chamberlain was short, Daniels was tall. Come on, people. Obviously, Daniels clearly owns that role. And when you look at some of the critical reviews at the time, and even some that have been posted on the internet since, typically even people who pan the movie call out Daniels' performance as being really the high spot of the movie. I don't know that I agree. I'll talk a little bit about that, but obviously that's been a popular consensus. And for many, many, many years after the movie came out, people who came to Gettysburg, took battlefield tours, wanted to see where the 20th Maine fought. And Eric, as you said, I think that's because of the quality of Jeff Daniels' performance as Joshua Chamberlain.
There is one character in the movie that maybe is not as well regarded in maybe the casting. And that, of course, is going to be the critical figure of Robert E. Lee, portrayed by Martin Sheen. Now, Sheen is an amazing actor. One of my favorite television shows of all time is West Wing. His performance as President Josiah Bartlett I thought was magnificent. But maybe everything he did is great as President Bartlett. As General Lee, maybe fell a little flat, and I think this is something we can talk about a little bit more here.
Yeah, easily I think the casting of Sheen as Lee is the most controversial aspect of it. And again, some of this ties back to the novel. If you read the novel, it is clear in the novel that Shara is attempting to portray Lee as sick, little broken down, a little worn out. And again, we can argue over the historical correctness of that, and we have touched on that a little bit in prior episodes. Whether Lee is just feeling some exhaustion, of course, diarrhea, suffering from, injuries from falling off of his horse. All of that is covered in a little more context in the novel. You don't get as much of that in the movie, so what you just sort of get in the movie is, oh, okay, Martin Sheen is acting tired. And again, if you don't have the context of that. I think that's where it loses a lot of people. But Sheen had reportedly turned down the role of Lee, and one of the things he had said was that not being from the South himself, he couldn't imagine breathing life into, the South's ultimate icon. One account that I've seen says it was Tom Berenger who actually talked Sheen into accepting the role and convinced Sheen that he could play Lee. But over the years, we've seen other people who had been attached, and maybe Maxwell tried to get it at different points, and you can kind of wonder how different the role would have been with any one of these guys playing Robert E. Lee. Tommy Lee Jones, who at that time would have been coming off the success of Lonesome Dove. Robert Duvall, who of course took on the role in Gods and Generals, but 10 years later when he was older. And the one that I always love is that supposedly Charlton Heston was considered for Robert E. Lee. Any of us who know Charlton Heston from Planet of the Apes and Damn You and all of that stuff can only imagine what that would have been like with Heston chewing scenery as Robert E. Lee.
Moses as Robert E. Lee.
There you go. And I thought of the Moses connection too, but I'm more of a Planet of the Apes guy, so I kind of went there with it. I could have got into that. That would have been kind of awesome. It would have taken the camp aspect of this movie, which some people think is already there, up to a completely new level. Nevertheless, Sheen, for the most part, portrays Lee as Lee was written. And there's some areas where I kind of question that in the movie, but again, if you really got a problem with Lee not being a strong figure, you got to go back to the book on that, and not necessarily just blame it all on the performance.
And I'm still kind of hung up on the Charlton Heston thing. I'm just imagining him as Lee on July 3rd, parting the Union line on Cemetery Ridge as if it's the Red Sea.
Could have been. I'm thinking again, Planet of the Apes. At the end where he's pounding on the sand, he could have been pounding on the dirt on Seminary Ridge after the failure of Pickett's charge. There's so many ways they could have gone with that.
Or just think about the iconic Stewart scene.
Yeah.
There is no time for that.
Yeah. Damn you! There is no time. Would have been awesome. It would have been awesome. Well, I guess they can't redo it because he's long dead. So.
Now I can see the reviews now. They're doing what ifs. We're doing what ifs on a movie.
Exactly. Relax, folks. We're just having a little fun. Hopefully you are too. So nevertheless, we got Martin Sheen as Robert E. Lee.
So now that the cast has been assembled, we want to kind of cover a little bit about the details about when and where it was filmed, because I think that's an interesting part of this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so principal photography commenced in July of 1992 in and around our very own Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The entire movie was filmed here locally. Some of the film scenes were shot on the actual battlefield. I think most notably the stepping off point for Pickett's division, Pickett's charge, was near the actual location at Spangler's Wood. They ran a camera track just next to the Spangler farm lane and kind of followed the troop movements up towards the Emmitsburg Road. And then when the troops reached the Emmitsburg Road, they proceeded to a set piece that was being filmed west of the town. So there's the Pickett's charge step off. Devil's Den appears in the movie. Little Round Top appears in the movie, including the Gouverneur Warren's statue, which is not so well hidden behind a fake tree. And the one that I think when I talk to people they don't always seem to realize is that the Slider Farm doubled as the exterior for Lee's headquarters. I think they shot the interior somewhere else, but there's a couple exterior scenes at Lee's headquarters that were done at the Slider Farm. So you got some stuff that's filmed on the actual battlefield. Most of it, though, was filmed on set locations west of town, in and around the Sachs-covered bridge area.
So peaceful.
So peaceful, right?
So peaceful.
So kind of on Pumping Station Road in that area. And I visited some of the set locations a couple years ago. You got to kind of know where to look, but you can still look at some of these things and say, oh, yeah, I see that. But most of it was filmed west of the town.
In 1998, when they had the 135th anniversary reenactment of the Battle of Gettysburg, I was actually here as a reenactor. And we were out there on Pumping Station Road, the big red barn that you see quite a bit. That was part of the reenactment. So some of those sites they used for later reenactments were part of the movie. So a lot of things west of town. I know they did some things out near Fairfield as well as Cashtown as well. You'll see the Cashtown Inn show up for one.
Right.
But it was filmed here in Adams County. And for a lot of people that were around at the time, it really was Hollywood Hollywood comes to the small town. I mean, when else are you getting this ensemble cast walking around the streets of Gettysburg? A lot of them bellying up to the bar at the Farnsworth House as well. But I think it was an interesting time for the town, and still people think of it fondly today.
I moved to Gettysburg in 2000. I started coming to Gettysburg as a visitor probably about 1995. So at that time, the memory of the movie and the filming was still very much alive, and you could find almost any bartender in town who would tell you a particular story about Tom Berenger and the ladies, or the guy who plays Walter Taylor and some of his extracurricular activities, or that some of the Shakespearean guys like Jeff Daniels or Richard Jordan might have been a little more standoffish. Those stories were still very active. Not so much now, but they were when I first came here. As you said, Farnsworth House was a popular hangout, and the artifacts, many of the artifacts from the movie, are still on display in the tavern at the Farnsworth House as part of their private collection. So if you're a movie buff, go check it out sometime if you haven't.
Filming began in July of 1992, but it also extended into the fall. And if you kind of look closely at some of the scenes, most famously where Chamberlain and Kilrain are on Little Round Top, you'll actually see their breath coming out because it's a little cooler. It's not the temperature it would have been at the Battle of Gettysburg. Once again, those are minor little things, but I mean, this was a pretty extensive filming schedule when it was here.
You know, what they did is they basically brought the Confederates in first in July, as you said, filmed their scenes, and then in the late part of August, Buford, Sam Elliott came to town. Buford's scenes were filmed, and then in September, they shifted the focus to Chamberlain and the 20th Maine, and that's why you probably specifically see indications of fall setting in during some of the 20th Maine scenes. You notice there's only one scene in the entire movie where a Confederate principal and a Union principal share screen time, and that's Armstead's death when he's picked up by Tom Chamberlain, which, as we know, is significant historical license, but it's the only time that you see two actors from opposing armies on screen here. Filming wrapped on September 30th, and the final scene filmed was that last scene in the movie where the brothers Joshua and Tom Chamberlain embrace. So the last scene in the movie is actually the last one filmed. Now, reportedly in the original script, it was supposed to end with Harrison the spy saying a line from Shakespeare, "We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little life is rounded with the sleep," before mounting on his horse and riding off. All I can say is thank God that kind of nonsense was scratched. So the movie ends with the Chamberlain brothers kind of hugging, and that was the last scene filmed.
So once filming wraps, there's a lot of interesting details about which screen this was going to be on. Was it going to be on the small screen, or is this going to be on the big screen? It went actually back and forth, and a lot of interesting little details here. Jim, you got a little more about that?
Yeah, I do a little bit. You know, I think a lot of this was initially spurred by the 1989 success of Lonesome Dove on TV, and obviously the movie Glory, which was in the theaters. But my understanding is initially ABC expressed interest in taking this as a TV miniseries. Unfortunately, in February of 1991, they showed the miniseries Son of the Morning Star, which has a special place in my heart because it's the most detailed film recreation ever made of Custer and the Little Bighorn, and based on the book of the same name, Son of the Morning Star. Unfortunately, Son of the Morning Star was both a commercial and critical failure, and because of that, ABC reportedly lost interest, and that again probably helped eventually turn it over as a miniseries for TNT for Ted Turner. Eric, now refresh my memory before we move on with some other stuff here. TNT, TBS, where would I have seen professional wrestling under Ted Turner during this era?
You would have been seeing it on TBS.
That's what I thought.
6:05 every Saturday night. But I think what's interesting at this point is today Ted Turner is known as a media mogul, but this period, early 90s into the mid-90s, is sort of the peak of his empire. I mean, he had the Braves, he had the Atlanta Hawks, he had WTBS, which broadcast throughout the nation. He also had TNT. But he also at this time owned New Line Cinema. So if you want to take this from, okay, we're not showing it on TV, let's try it on the big screen. What better way to get it on the big screen is if you own a production company like he did with New Line Cinema at that time.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And you touched on this being kind of a golden era for the Civil War. I'll just want to add, too, that it was really a golden era for historical epics. Kind of during this period of the late 80s to early 90s. You've got Glory, you've got Lonesome Dove, you've got Son of the Morning Star, you've got Unforgiven, which was the Clint Eastwood Western released in August of 92. Last of the Mohicans came out in September of 92. Then Gettysburg follows up in 93. And one of our mutual favorites, Tombstone, comes out in December of 1993 with many of the same Gettysburg cast. So you're right, you've got this kind of then shifting over to Ted Turner's New Line Cinema. You've got an era here where, frankly, there's quite a number of classic and successful historic epics coming out. But I kind of thought it would just be interesting, too, to see what else was popular in the theaters in 1992 when this movie was kind of getting into production. 92 saw Basic Instinct, Aladdin, Wayne's World, White Men Can't Jump, Lethal Weapon 3, A Few Good Men, A League of Their Own. And during the first week of filming, the #1 movie in the country was the classic Mo Money.
Who doesn't forget where they were when they first saw Mo Money?
So anyways, as Eric said, it got turned over to Turner's New Line Cinema. And the problem, of course, is you had a movie that clocked in at 254 minutes, which was I can't even say that with a straight face, one of the longest films released by a major film studio in the United States. The problem with that length of a running time was obviously that you could only show it so many times a day. That cut down on the number of people who saw it in the theater.
Well, for me, I saw it at 1 o'clock. The show times were 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock. So that doesn't really give you much of a margin. And, if you have a fifth grader, you're not going to have them see a 4-hour movie at 7 o'clock at night and then turn right back around and go back to school. So I had to be checked out of school, which I guess kind of defeats the purpose of that now that I look back on it. But
well, you turned out okay, right?
Yeah, I turned out okay.
Did it go on your permanent record, ditching school to see a 254-minute Ted Turner movie?
You know what? I think when my mother checked me out to go see a Civil War movie, I think the school just said, you know what? Perfect.
Yeah, let him go.
Yeah, just let him go.
Yeah. Despite all the limitations, it grossed about $12.8 million on a $20 million budget. Now, I guess you would look at that in isolation and say, geez, the thing was a bomb. But since you really didn't plan on releasing it in the theater anyways, I'm kind of thinking, the $12.7 million was kind of a bonus. It was kind of found money. And then you release it on TV and you get the advertising revenue from TV. It is reportedly an all-time top seller on VHS and DVD. So I'm presuming the thing has more than made its money back over the ensuing 25 years.
I also read it was in limited release.
Yeah.
So this is not nationwide. So not only is it showing twice a day, it's in a limited number of theaters. So you're not going to make as much as you would for a larger film of that scope. But between the DVD sales, the VHS sales, this thing has more than made enough money based on its initial budget.
Well, I hope so. I hope so for everybody involved. So, by the way, a director's cut, which was 271 minutes, was released in 2011. That director's cut is actually the version that Eric and I both watched on the rewatch for this episode of the podcast.
So when we look at this movie, there's, of course, the reception we give it today. I mean, we make fun of the beards, we make fun of some of the scenes, but we forget that this movie actually did come out once in theaters. So it was having contemporary critical reception as well as audience goers, giving their feedback on it. And Jim, I think you did a little bit of research into what was the critical reception of this movie.
Yeah, I did a little bit, and obviously today we have the modern review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes. Some of you might be surprised to realize that Gettysburg actually holds a favorable rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It's an 80% favorable, which is a lot higher than more popularly regarded films. So it's got an 80% on Rotten Tomatoes with 20 reviews. Roger Ebert. How many of you remember Siskel and Ebert? But for those of you who remember Siskel and Ebert, who really invented kind of the whole thumbs up, thumbs down kind of thing, Roger Ebert gave it a thumbs up and 3 stars, while Siskel gave it a thumbs down. Siskel said it was bloated Southern propaganda, although again, both men praised Jeff Daniels' performance. I do want to, if I could, note what Ebert said, Quote, Maxwell deserves credit for not hedging his bets. This is a film that Civil War buffs will find indispensable, even if others might find it interminable. I began watching with comparative indifference and slowly got caught up in the majestic advance of the Enterprise. By the end, I had a completely new idea of the reality of war in the 19th century when battles still consisted largely of men engaging each other in hand-to-hand combat. And I understood the Civil War in a more immediate way than ever before. And that was Ebert, who gave it not only a thumbs up, but 3 stars, even if he said 43,000 men were killed in the battle. So again, you got this casualty thing that we're still, as interpreters, kind of dealing with. One more comment, contemporary review, Eric, from the New York Times, which also gave it a positive review. They said, Mr. Daniels, again highlighting Jeff Daniels, Mr. Daniels' luminous performance as the heroic colonel dominates half of the film, and when the actor all but disappears in part 2, he is sorely missed. I disagree with that. If we ever get around to actually covering our rewatch here, we'll talk about that. But other critics commented on the indulgence, specifically of the length of the film. The Deseret News in Salt Lake City said the result is not without interest, but the sheer length is a ridiculous indulgence.
So as we are looking at our time right now, we are approaching the 1 hour mark, just talking about the background of this movie. This is kind of like the movie equivalent of The Peach Orchard. We spent all this time, we haven't even gotten into the fighting yet. So I think what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of put a pause here. If you think about the DVD version of this movie, you have to flip the disc. This is kind of the podcast version of that, where you're going to flip the disc. And next week, we'll get into actually the nuts and bolts of the movie, what we like, what we don't like, and move forward with that. So we hope you enjoyed kind of a little bit of background. We don't know how many of our listeners really know all of these details about the movie. We know it happens, but a little bit about the details and the background of it. And next week, we'll come back to you with actually the deep dive into the portrayal of these characters and the action itself.
Yeah, and hopefully if you didn't know the backstory here, hopefully the next time you kind of criticize this book and this movie on social media, hopefully this will give you a little more context over how and why book and this movie were made. So, look, we may not change your mind. We like it. You may not like it. But at least we're giving you a little bit of context on how this thing turned out the way it did.
All right, so with that, we want to let you know that you can find us on social media at Facebook at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, on Twitter at Gettysburg Pod, on Instagram at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. Also, you can email us at gettysburgpodcast@gmail.com. Now, as we always do, we want to give credit to our fellow licensed battlefield guides and urge you, if you are coming to Gettysburg, to please give us a chance to show you around the field. Also, once again, want to thank our sponsor for the episode. Jim, do you want to tell us a little bit again about our sponsor?
Yeah, as we said at the outset, tonight's episode was sponsored by a listener and a fellow Gettysburg enthusiast. He's one of you guys, Michael Hamula. And Michael Hamula is the founder of RPM. If your company is on a quest for senior and executive level talent, the kind of talent that will move the needle on your corporate performance, visit Michael's website at www.rpmsearchgroup.com to learn more about RPM Search Group and how they help companies in the United States and around the world identify, evaluate, and hire talent that drives profit and performance. And so again, we want to thank Michael Hamula and RPM Search Group for helping to underwrite some of the costs of this episode. Thanks, Michael.
And I think that's a great segue into, once again, we want to thank our listeners. We've really enjoyed our interaction with you, your support. We can't thank you enough. Also, if you get a chance, go on to the podcast platform of your choice. Please write us a review. With that, we're going to put a bow onto this episode. Next week, we will do our deep dive into the content of the movie Gettysburg itself. So we hope that you will join us for that. And once again, we want to thank the Reliance Mine Saloon here in Gettysburg for hosting us here, as they always do.
Thanks again, folks, and we will see you next time.